Welcome back to the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. I am your host, Sean, joined as always by Johnston for a special edition of our Shooting the Breeze episodes. Now, this was an episode which was thought about by myself, by you, Johnston, but predominantly by Chris Wardrope, who was going to be on this episode, but for unforeseen circumstances can't be with us for this recording, which is a big shame because I know how much Chris loves talking about the Fab Four and that era of boxing. So we're going to really enjoy this because me and you, Johnston, over the past three and a half years, coming up to 4 years, I've actually done so much on all of these fighters. We've done a career profile on every single one of these fighters in the Fab Four. We've done a few of the legendary nights on some of the fights in this series of fights between them all. And we feel like we've got the knowledge base now to actually sit and have a Shooting the Breeze style conversation where we can just say what we think, whatever comes to our mind, whatever fights we want to interject and talk about, or whatever fighters we want to bring into the equation. That could have been, say, the fifth member of this really, really great series of fights, and obviously including the great fighters as well. So yeah, guys, I'm looking forward to this. I hope you guys enjoy listening to this episode. And, you know, there's no scripting to it. There's no real storytelling involved in it like we normally do with our stuff. This is just us two talking about the Fab Four.
What a great discussion to have. There's nothing better. And as you say, we have done so much on the Fab Four. We've done every legendary night, every fight, I suppose we should say, apart from Hagler Duran, although we've touched on it in their career profile on each one. And it is just an era where you have four of the best fighters around in that decade, and they fought each other. So we can't really say about any more at the minute. Hopefully that changes after the Garcia and Davis fight. Maybe we have another Fab Four, Fab Five this decade. It'd be amazing if we could, because this story of these four guys will never change, will it? It will always be there. You're talking of the very first fight between them all was in 1980, and that was like 43 years ago. I mean, and we still salivate over that now. I mean, honestly, I watched that fight. The brawl in Montreal it's just an epic fight, and there's some great footage of it on YouTube as well. Great footage, excellent footage. And yeah, I mean, we're going to all the fights, and just, as you say, Sean, we're just going to roll it from the top of our heads, but these four will just never die. They will never die. They will always be with us, and they're just a huge credit to this sport.
Absolutely. Huge credit to this sport. And this is why people like us love doing podcasts on people like them, because they have created a legacy and an impact in the sport of boxing that, like you say, will surpass many generations. And
that's the word, legacy.
Yes, exactly, legacy. And generations after our generation will still revel and salivate over the history of it, like we do when we cover our old school career profiles, when we do like the Jack Johnsons and the Harry Grebs and the Joe Gans of the world, and even the Stanley Ketchells for the darker side of boxing. We revel over stuff like that because we get to learn so much about these fighters and what life was like back then, and how that affected the sport and the rules of the sport and how things were so much different. And this is what's going to happen in generations to come with these four fighters, the Kings, as they're also called as well. The documentary that they brought out a couple of years ago called The Kings, about these four fighters. So if you haven't watched that, guys, I'd recommend go and watch it. Brilliant little docu-series about these guys. But there's so much out there on them, so many books, there's so much literature out there on them. We've obviously done our stuff on them, but I'm just happy to be talking about this topic again because I can't not think about boxing and not think about the Fab Four and think about the impact and the legacy, the generation, the decade it was in, and how it's completely surpassed what was going on in boxing at the time. And if you think about the 1980s, automatically you think about the lower weight categories in boxing. You don't necessarily then jump to the heavyweights. The 60s and the 70s that we're covering at the moment on Boxing Through the Decades, you know, that is an era of the heavyweights. Like, no other weight really comes close to it. But the 1980s is all about the lighter weight categories, and in particular these categories. So you got guys like Roberto Duran, who was in the lightweight category, and he moves up throughout the weight categories. You've got Tommy Hearns, Sugar Ray Leonard, who were in the welterweight category, and then you've got Marvin Hagler, who was a career middleweight, and all these guys at some point down the line fought each other, which is testament to them as fighters, that they all took chances at some point throughout their careers to take on the very best, whether it be jumping up a weight or whether it be fighting a guy who was undefeated and fearless, coming back after so many years out. It was just a testament to what boxing is all about and what boxing should be like today. And this is why we revel in it, because we want to see something like this again. We look at like you said, Davis and Garcia fight quite recently. You look at the lightweight and super lightweight divisions in boxing currently, and you've got a plethora of fighters who could quite easily be the Fab Five or even the Super Six. Do you know, like, if you want to name them that, you've got guys like Shakur Stevenson and Devin Haney, and you've got guys like Gervonta Davis and Ryan Garcia, and throw Teofimo Lopez into the mix, and you can even throw Lomachenko. Even though he's an aging Lomachenko, you can still throw him in there. There's still fights to be had, and I think this is what the Fab Four has done, is created this desire, this need for this type of mini tournament to happen again without it being an official tournament. We want something like this to happen again in the sport.
Exactly, and it's not always about having some sort of tournament. It seems to be those like Super Six tournaments, which we've said how much we enjoy those, and they're a great. They make the sport worthwhile when watching, because it sort of forces guys in the top of their division to fight against each other, which is good to see, and that's why they were so good, is because you did in the end pretty much get the best against the best, which is what you wanted, and in the end you get a guy that comes out on top. I mean, the one thing about the Fab Four is that they didn't have that. I mean, you think back, I mean, Roberto Duran, I mean, he started in 68. I mean, it's incredible. He started in 1968. He was the one that had the longest career, or started off longer, and he had the longest career of the lot. I mean, just thinking about Roberto Duran, I mean, his lightweight career, for me, is probably, it makes him the best lightweight of all time. And I think the only one I can really think of that could match Duran as a lightweight would be a Joe Gans, maybe even a Benny Leonard. When you look at their careers and who they fought, I suppose you could probably say they're the guys that probably come close to him, in my opinion. But Duran as a lightweight, go through the 60s and into the 70s, he dominated in the 70s. I mean, he was a terrific fighter. He had that fantastic trilogy, Sean, didn't he, where we done the legendary nights with Esteban Jesus. And that trilogy there with Duran and Jesus is so underrated. And I thought we'd done it good justice when we went into the details with them two. And how that story ended was just, it was traumatic. It was devastating. You felt so sad for Esteban Jesus, even though he was a convicted murderer, albeit accidentally. But just the whole picture with Duran as a lightweight, the Ken Buchanan fights, great fight with him. I say that, I mean, Buchanan did get it in the bullocks and couldn't continue. I mean, he has its. Would he have even won that fight? No, I don't think so. I think Duran had his number, to be fair, but God rest Buchanan's soul as well. God rest his soul, recently lost. So yeah, I mean, look, I suppose I just jumping straight in here, Sean. Duran as a lightweight. I mean, do you want to come in and say something about Duran?
Yeah,
we're gonna go through that in a way with our 70s decade, just to point that out. If you haven't, the boxing for the decades, check it out, because we're going to be doing that soon. We're going to be discussing Duran as a lightweight. We've already done it as a career profile, but I mean, yeah, just on that trilogy, Sean, and I mean that he had a great. His career could have ended then. He would still be a great to then go on in the next decade, in the 80s, right at the start of that, beat Leonard. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it?
Well, you start to think about early on in this conversation who the greatest fighter of them all is, and I know it's something we'll come to at the end, but early on, when you set it up like that and you set the context to Roberto Duran being the first fighter to discuss, you sell me straight away on it. You sell me like Roberto Duran comes up and has a fantastic lightweight career, revered by many as the greatest lightweight of all time. Then we go into the next decade and he fights and beats Sugar Ray Leonard. yes, okay, we know the no mass fight. We can have a conversation about that. But I think the achievements straight away from him are they're unparalleled of its time, really, of that sort of era of time. And for him to do that, for him to be able to achieve that so early on is fantastic. And you feel like when he sort of moves from lightweight up to welterweight, it's like he's only just getting started, man. Because eventually he would go on, he would fight up at light welterweight, he would fight up at light middleweight, he would fight up at middleweight. He'd even go as far as super middleweight in the latter end of his career, of course. But look, this guy is a bona fide legend. This is why he is revered as a fighter, is because of them accolades and what he was able to achieve and how he had no fear and he was able to go up against such bigger guys, but yet still be as impactful in his own way against those as he was against those in his own weight category when he was younger. Duran's biggest problem, as most of you will probably know, was his outside of the ring antics, the party lifestyle. He loved the party, and it was never more evident than in the rematch with Sugar Ray Leonard, of course. And I think if you've not seen the Hands of Stone movie, it's quite depicted well in there, and we did our version for Roberto Duran's career profile, and we touched on it in Sugar Ray Leonard's career profile as well. I think Roberto Duran, even with the party antics involved in it, he's still a legendary fighter. But then you start to think to yourself, oh, the big what if? What if he wasn't a party animal? What if he would have been more dedicated at times? Would he have gone on to beat some of those guys and beat them more legitimately, or actually be, in with the shout of being the best fighter of this bunch of fighters? Well, I certainly think Roberto Duran, for me, is a good way to start talking about these fighters, because he obviously naturally is the lightest fighter, because he started out at lightweight and he started in 1968 and he went on and had a wonderful career. But Roberto Duran is certainly in with a shout for me as being the best of the bunch. But you've got to then consider the fights he had, the wins, the losses against these guys. And then you start to sort of put these comparisons together, don't you? Of like, oh, well, hang on, he beats Sugar Ray Leonard, then he loses to Sugar Ray Leonard. Tommy Hearns absolutely sparks him out. Then he goes 15 rounds with Marvin Hagler up at middleweight. And then you think to yourself, how the bloody hell does this man do this? He's just like a machine. When everyone writes him off, he comes back and wins a title. It's unbelievable what he achieved in this sport. And talking about it again makes me remember it all and makes me realise how much of a legend this guy actually is. But what a great person to begin with for the episode is Roberto Duran. I'd love to know what everybody else listening, what you think of Roberto Duran and where you sort of sit him within this Fab Four. Please make sure when you listen to the episode, you do send us like a little tweet at BTR Boxing Pod and you say like your order of how you would rank these fighters, and also the fights that they were involved in, because we are going to discuss some of them in more detail as well. But Johnston, Roberto Duran, great start to the show, great fighter, but let's move on. Let's talk about the next one. Who do you want to pick next to discuss?
Well, I think because of the fact the brawl in Montreal was the first one that started it, and I think what the mistake that this guy made, as in Sugar Ray Leonard, was that he fought Duran's fight in that first fight in Canada. He didn't do the things that we knew he was good at, and a lot of people used to criticise Sugar Ray Leonard actually very early in his career about the amount of money. He was this fantastic amateur. He had a great career, fantastic Olympic background, wins gold medal. He's goes back to Canada where he won that gold medal to fight the best lightweight about, who he's struggling at the weight. He there's no doubt about it. He's drinking too much. He's eating too much. He needs to get into that weight, and Duran finally gets himself a 147, although he even said himself that he was still drinking and eating too much. But for that first Leonard fight, he was on it, and he fought his fight. Leonard fought his fight. But the one thing I will say about Sugar Ray is I feel when we've done his career profile and we've done legendary nights on it, is that this fight, although he lost it, a lot of people give him great respect because he went the full distance with the great Roberto Duran. And he took some whacks that night. And that pretty boy image of Sugar Ray Leonard went out the window because he decided he's going to slug it with the great Duran. And although he lost, he still come out as a winner because people respected him more for that. And then when he went home and he was depressed and he was sitting there and he's thinking, shit, my life's finished. I don't know what I'm going to do. He snaps out of it and he gets himself ready and he gets himself in the best shape of his life. And he gets that fight early, knowing Duran is well out of shape. But take a Duran, obviously, he has only a few weeks or so to get rid of about 20, 25 pounds, I believe it is, because he's turned into a little fat man, isn't he? A little fat man, Duran. And then obviously Leonard has that amazing performance in the Nomas fight, and it is outstanding. I mean, look, we can say whether Duran had stomach cramps. We can discuss that if you like. We can say that Duran coming out of shape. But Sean, Sugar Ray Leonard against Roberto Duran in that rematch is just beautiful to watch. It really is a stunning performance from Sugar Ray Leonard. And then from there, I mean, I'll let you carry on from there. Have you say on that fight, and then we'll carry on. But I think the next man to talk about is the great Sugar Ray Leonard.
Yeah, it's a good caveat to go into, really, with Sugar Ray. And the brawl in Montreal, like you say, started the whole series off over the next 9 years, which is amazing when you think about it. Literally, these 4 men all contested fights with one another for like 9 years in that decade. They pretty much ruled that decade, which is why many people look at the 80s and they look at the Fab Four and that's all they think about. You know, the heavyweights had some great fights at that time, but really it was these guys in the lower weights that really brought everything to the forefront, and how boxing would then move into the 90s and we'd have some really great fights in lower weight categories. But it was this that really started everything. So the brawl in Montreal, one of our really legendary nights. We loved covering it. We loved covering the stories behind it. Then you get the Nomas fight, of course. Like you described it beautifully there in the way that Sugar Ray goes home, which is what we discussed. We get the story of it. He goes back. He feels depressed. He thinks, this is it. I'm finished. And then something changes within him, and he changes, and he puts an absolute beat down on Roberto Duran in that second fight. And Roberto Duran, that's it. He's done. Just that's it. He's done it. He's no mas, as he says, no mas, no more. I'm done. And that's it. You know, like one of them moments that is so synonymous with this sport. Like, but Sugar Ray going into that moment was absolutely putting a beating on him, completely putting a beating on him. And this Duran just couldn't handle it. Duran, whatever excuse you could use for that time, whatever excuse you want to justify it with. At the end of the day, he wasn't dedicated enough. It's quite obvious at that time in his life, he wasn't dedicated enough. He probably thought he'd go through Sugar Ray Leonard again, and he just didn't. Sugar Ray came back with that hunger and that desire and that will to win, and he completely put it on him and created one of those most famous moments, or infamous moments in Duran's case, in boxing. And it really did ruin Duran's reputation at this point. Because if you think about it, we're talking about how much of a legend he is. You think about, there's a few years there, isn't there, in the 80s after the Nomas fight where, he sort of sinks into the background a little bit, where all the other fights start to happen. We're going to talk about Leonard and Hearns, of course, next, and their first fight. You get them fights happening. In the background, you've got Marvin Hagler coming to the ascendancy, and then you've got the fights with obviously Hagler and Hearns to discuss, of course. But in the background, little Roberto Duran, the little fat man, as you called him, he's got to go back to the bottom of
that to his face, even. I wouldn't say that to his face.
The little fat man goes back to the drawing board, and he really does. When you think about it and you look at his career after that, he works his way back into contention, doesn't he? Think about it. Like, that fight ruins his reputation. Like, it massively ruins his reputation because he's seen as a quitter, and nobody wants to go near him. His reputation's tarnished. He's ruined at this point. But then in the background, like I said, he starts to chip away. Doesn't go unnoticed. No, at all. It doesn't go unnoticed. But what happens is, well, all the other guys at the top are starting to really come to the ascendancy. Roberto Duran's working away in that background to get himself back into contention again and get himself in there. So, fair play, after that, he does what he needs to do to get himself back into the limelight once again. But it's Sugar Ray's turn. Let's talk about Sugar Ray, and let's talk about, where Sugar Ray was at this point in time. That win over Duran was a huge slice of redemption pie for him. huge slice of pie, because he needed that. He needed to prove to himself, he needed to prove to his wife, who Roberto Duran was trash-talking in the first fight, which essentially got under his skin. He needed to prove to everybody that I can beat this guy, man. I can beat him. And he did. And he does it in emphatic fashion. And then from there on, he has 2 more fights. And then we get the Thomas Hearns fight, which is an absolutely fantastic fight. One of the greatest fights in boxing history. And this is where you feel like the speed's starting to pick up on the car now. We've just kind of set off here in this metaphorical car. We've just set off with Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard and their 2 fights. And then all of a sudden, you get Hearns and Leonard. And one hell of a fight that was. Now, as we told the story in our Legendary Nights series about this particular fight, there was a lot of talk of these guys fighting a couple of years earlier. And the right move was made to keep them away from each other just for a little bit longer, because when it did happen, the people around them, the trainers involved, knew it was going to be one hell of a fight and for a hell of a lot more money.
It was, and you're right, as that's a great point to mention there. So, I mean, I think that was 1978. It was around that time, the summer of 78, and ABC offer Leonard the chance to fight Tommy Hearns. I mean, it's crazy. I think it was agreed $100,000, I believe, something along them lines. And Hearns agreed to it's $100,000 for Leonard and $12,500 for Hearns. That's right. And obviously Angelo Dundee heard about it while he was on his fishing trip, and he raced back from Florida Keys to stop it, put an end to that. No way are we going to have this, because the fight between these two is going to be bigger and it's going to earn everyone a lot more money. And boy, he weren't wrong. I mean, it was a tremendous fight. I mean, it's one of them fights as well, where you have the one guy where you think he's in control. So for me, Tommy Hearns, we'll come on to Tommy. Obviously, we're still on Sugar Ray here, so we stick with Leonard. But Tommy was a devastating fight. He was so tall, so rangy. And considering we've been doing boxing for a decade, so in my head, it's like a Sandy Sadler. It's like a Bob Foster, where you have this guy, he's very tall, very slim, long arms, and unbelievable power. And it seems incredible to see a guy with Tommy Hearns' physique and see that he was fighting at welterweight, even lower than that at times. I mean, it's crazy. But Sugar Ray Leonard, obviously, on a great run from the Duran fight, and he takes that fight, and it's the showdown. For me, Hearns is in control. He seems to be in control of that fight. And it takes a turn. And it takes a turn because of a great trainer. I mean, the one thing we have... Do you know what? The one thing we haven't mentioned yet, Sean, is the fact that all these fights are for world titles. And they're irrelevant. Like, the world titles are irrelevant. All you see is the names. In fact, at times you forget about the weights because it doesn't matter. You see Leonard, you see Hearns. All right, we know it's the welterweight division. But it's irrelevant. We don't even care about the titles. What you care about is the fight and who's going to win it. And the coaches in the corner, you've got Hearns, you've got Emmanuel Stewart coming from the Kronk Gym. And then you've got Angelo Dundee in Leonard's corner. 2 of the greatest trainers of all time against 2 of the greatest fighters of all time. I mean, it has everything about it. And obviously for me, Hearns is in front. He's looking in control. And obviously Dundee gives Leonard those words in the round. I think it's the 9th round. You're blowing it, son. You're blowing it. And that is a moment when you see, again, that switch in Leonard, which is what he had. He had it against Duran away from the ring, and he had it against Hearns in the ring that night. And that was the inspirational words that he needed to turn that fight in his favour and stop Tommy Hearns in the 14th, who was exhausted by that point, mind you. But what a fight. What a topsy-turvy fight that was, Sean.
Absolutely love it. And, it just brings, like, the hairs on my arm standing up, like, going through this conversation again. And that's not an exaggeration, guys. Like, it really does. Like, I think about it, and it's just this overwhelming feeling of excitement. And even though this fight is so old now, you think about it, 1981 this fight took place. That's like 42 years ago. Exactly. And the fact that we can get so passionate and excited about it now, because we've seen it so many times, it's just an exemplary way to look at boxing, an exemplary good fight where you can look back and just say, oh my God, you would love to be around these fights. You would love to be in the crowd. You'd love to be ringside. You'd just love to be in the whole hype that surrounds this sort of stuff. And honestly, like, I look at these fights and I talk about them and I get really excited because I think, I just envision what it would have been like for someone like us, as big boxing fans that we are, to have been around that era, seeing how much of a good fight this was and how significant it was. And as opposed to people then, who were watching it, probably didn't realise how significant this fight was. Because it is, you think about it, for Leonard's career, this is a hugely significant fight. And this is where we can now touch really on Leonard's career now, because from this fight now, he then goes into the fight in 82 against Bruce Finch, gets the win, and then doesn't fight because of the issue again with his eye. So he doesn't fight again until 84, and then he's out again. He goes into a second retirement and doesn't come back out until he fights Marvin Hagler in 1987, which is, of course, a fight we're going to be discussing. So when you look at sort of Sugar Ray's career in the 80s, he loses. We lose the best parts of him, I think. And some might say we don't, because they're going to talk about the Hagler fight and say, well, look at how good he was in that fight after all that time out. Well, obviously there are some stories surrounding why he was so good in the ring that night against Hagler, which we'll remind you of if you don't already know him. But you think about the 80s, he doesn't spend a lot of time in the ring as probably what he would have wanted to because of the issues with the detached retina that he was suffering with. And then there was the fight with Aaron Pryor that was about to be signed, sealed and delivered. The fight that should have been, Aaron Pryor should have been like the 5th member. And then you think about Wilfred Benitez, he should have been the 6th member. He should have been like the Super 6 and not the Fab Four. And you start to get excited about the prospects of what that would have been like in a bit of a round robin moment between all these guys. But focusing back on Sugar Ray here, talking about him, he loses a lot of time. Like when Ali goes into exile and comes out, we lost the best parts of him. Did you think we lost the best parts of Sugar Ray in that time that he was out?
I think definitely. I mean, the fact is, you have the Hearns fight that if anything, you wanted that Hearns rematch because of the way it went. Emmanuel Stewart will tell you, or would have told you to his blue in the face, that Tommy Hearns overtrained, and he couldn't stop him from overtraining. And the hangers on, and there were certain things. I think they give him a leg massage before the fight as well, and that's why his legs went. I'm sure it was the Leonard fight and not the Hagler fight. As one of them, actually, it might have been the Hagler fight. We'll come to that. But either way, there were things that were happening with Tommy that Emmanuel didn't like, and he was a bit of an issue at times between them. But either way, Leonard beat Hearns in the proper way. Down on the scorecards, comes back and stops him. Beautiful. There should have been a rematch. And if there had been a rematch in 82, 83, who knows what would have happened, whether it had been the same again. But I think you would have got their rematch in a point where we got the best of them. Maybe it would have been in at 154 if it would have been in the weight above the welterweight division, because that's Tommy. I mean, we'll come to that, but that's Tommy Hearns' best division. So if Leonard had fought him then, I do favour Hearns at that weight. If he'd have had to try and keep him at welterweight, then probably Leonard again. But I do think for that 2 years, Sean, absolutely, he could have fought Hearns again, and he probably would have fought Hagler earlier at middleweight. So he may have got. This is what in my head, I envision it is probably they could have fought above the welterweight division, super welterweight, light middleweight, if you want to call it, Hearns, Leonard, that is, in a rematch, and then he would have prepared Leonard for the Hagler fight at middleweight. That being said, I think Hearns would have had him, and I think Hagler might have had him a little bit earlier. So it's a weird one, because I think he fights a more dangerous Hearns a year later, and he probably fights Hagler if he fought him a year earlier, or 2 years, or 3 years earlier. He definitely fights a more dangerous Hagler. So in a way, if he'd have fought them two in particular, I think he probably would have become a bit of a cropper, to be honest with you. So it's interesting. I think we did get robbed of the best years, because you could have even had the Duran fight. Because Duran, I know he lost to Wilfred Benitez, he lost to Kirtland Lang, but he was making his way back for a short period of time around this time, so he could have come back and maybe even had that third fight earlier. So I think we get robbed of extra fights between them, because I think Leonard would have fought him. But in saying that, remember that moment, Sean, when he's like, he calls a massive press conference, Sugar Ray Leonard, and everyone's thinking he's going to call it, he's going to make the fight. You know, he brings Hagler's sitting in the audience, and everyone's thinking, right, this is it. Leonard's going to announce it. I'm going to fight Marvin Hagler. And he turns around and says, it's never going to happen. I mean, what a showman for a start. But you just see Hagler's face, just like looking at him like, what a time waster. You fucking time waster. You know, Hagler didn't mess about, you know. As he says, little pinky fingers. He ain't bothered. He'd cut his finger off to fight you. That is the type of guy Hagler was. Yeah, I mean, what a moment that was, Sean.
Yeah, it was a moment, and we will come on to some of these moments. I'm interested in kind of keeping the timeline a little bit the same. So it makes sense really now to talk about Hearns, doesn't it? Before we move on to Hagler at the end, because you know Hagler obviously is the one at the higher weight than all of them at this point. He's always fighting at middleweight, and then you go to Hearns' career, and we've talked about him obviously fighting Sugar Ray, but at the point, you know, he fights him, he's already champion. He becomes a champion in 1980 by beating Pepino Cuevas. So he beats him, absolutely demolishes him in 2 rounds.
Demolishes Cuevas. My goodness me. And I just before you carry on, it was Michael Katz, the sports writer, that said it occurred to him that no one had ever called out Tommy Hearns, ever. Nobody wanted to fight a 6'1" welterweight with the power to destroy Pepino Cuevas inside 2 rounds, and he weren't wrong, mate, was he?
No, he weren't wrong. So then he's WBA champion. Sugar Ray's obviously going in as WBC welterweight champion in the 81 fight. We get a really good fight. Then Ray Leonard obviously moves on, and we just talked about Ray Leonard's career. But what's happening for Tommy Hearns in the interim while all this is going on? Well, obviously he returns then, doesn't he? He returns and he moves up a weight, and he goes to 154 after losing to Ray Leonard. And then he goes on to beat Wilfred Benitez in 82, which is then when he becomes a 2-weight world champion. And this is where he starts to then rebuild his career from that point on. And you said it earlier, and I'm touching back on what you said when you mentioned that Tommy Hearns at 154, unstoppable. Man, he was like he's probably like the greatest 154 of all time.
Wow. I mean, I don't even know. I mean, Sean, the Duran knockout says it all.
Yeah. He does. Yeah, the Duran knockout in 84, of course, the way he actually had him lay Sparko on his face after knocking Roberto Duran out in 84. And then obviously you move on, and you will talk about the Hagler fight shortly, but we get the Hagler fight, which is just absolutely a fight of epic proportion. But for Tommy Hearns, he moves up to 154. He gets the WBC title. He beats Wilfred Benitez over 15 rounds. Another great fight, and this is why we talk about Benitez being like the 5th member of this Kings quartet, or well, whatever you want to label it, Fab Four, the Kings, however you want to call it. But Wilfred Benitez, maybe Aaron Pryor, you know, there's definitely a couple of fighters that could certainly slot in.
Maybe Alexis Aguayo in there.
Yeah.
Maybe, I know he was a super feather, but could have fought in lightweight. But yeah, probably a bit too light for it. But yeah, definitely Pryor Benitez, 100%.
So let's look at Hagler in all of this, because Hagler's he's like the outsider in this conversation, really, because all these guys are at lower weight categories, and you think about it, and you've got Marvin Hagler, who's the career middleweight, who takes what feels like an age to get his opportunity. I mean, we covered his career profile, and it was one that I really enjoyed, actually, because I didn't really know a lot of Hagler's origins going into that. I knew a lot, obviously, about his big fights, but when we did the career profile on Hagler, it was really good to learn of his origins, and he had a struggle. In comparison, really, I think, in boxing terms, he struggled more to get his opportunity than any of the other 3 did. And even when you think about Duran, he comes from a real poor upbringing, but still manages to get the opportunity. It feels like we was waiting a lifetime for Hagler when you look at his career. We went through it, and then when he does get his opportunity to become a champion, he has that draw with Vito Antuofermo, and then he doesn't get another opportunity then. That was 79. He gets his next opportunity the next year, and he becomes the champion by beating Alan Minter in that infamous fight obviously over here in Wembley Arena, which was where there was a very racist crowd at the time, and they were all chucking bottles in the ring after he obviously won and beat the favourite Alan Minter. But that's where he comes onto the scene now. So from 1980, he becomes WBA, WBC champion in the middleweight division. He has the great fight with Antifermo again and beats Antifermo. And then he has another good fight with Mustafa Hamsho as well. I thought that was another good fight when we covered his career. And then it's around probably 1982 to 83 where I think Hagler's, at this point, he's solidified himself pretty much as the best middleweight on the planet at this point. And it's at that point where Roberto Duran then creeps back into the conversation, because this is where he's trying to get himself back into the ascendancy. He jumps up in weights and he takes on Marvin Hagler. And what happens? They go 15 rounds in an IBF, a WBA and a WBC middleweight title fight. But it's crazy, isn't it? Because I remember having this conversation about Duran in particular and how Duran goes 15 rounds with one of the most ferocious fighters of that time. But yet when he fights Tommy Hearns in 84, Tommy Hearns sparks him, but Marvin Hagler couldn't. And we had this conversation last time. I remember thinking, like, Hagler was so ferocious and he was a hard puncher as well. But how did Tommy Hearns do it? But Tommy Hearns just had the leverage in his punches, and there was just something about him. He was just able to land them exploding bombs on a fighter's chin. But this was where they had that sort of mutual opponent in Duran at this point, where Hagler goes 15 rounds, and it makes Tommy Hearns, of course, think, well, maybe I could do something against this Marvin Hagler.
It does, and you're right. I mean, the fact that he does get Duran, like the spark out, the knockout, it literally, the way he's against the ropes, he lands face first. I mean, Duran is asleep by the time he hits that canvas. It is absolutely destructive. I mean, it's a wow moment. Like, 84 and Duran's getting wiped out like that by Tommy Hearns. It was absolutely amazing. And as you say, he's fighting Hagler before that in 83 and going 15 rounds with him. It's crazy. It just shows you that styles make fights. And Tommy Hearns at that point in that weight, he was just a devastating puncher. And Hagler, do you know what as well with the Duran and Hagler fight is Duran fought all right as well. Like, it was close for I think about 12 rounds. If that had been a 12-rounder, there would have been you could probably, I think Hagler still wins it, but I think there was an argument there that could have been a draw. So it's only sort of those championship rounds, but back then obviously the 15 rounds, the championship rounds were the big rounds, those last sort of 4 or 5 rounds. And that was where the fantastic Hagler goes on and takes that win against Duran. But as you say, Sean, I mean, Hagler took an eternity, bless him. I mean, he 46-2-1, and he literally fought the Philadelphia circuit, the Boston circuit. And, if one thing we do know through when we do our career profiles, legendary nights and dark side of boxing, is that Philadelphia circuit is tough. It's tough still today, and it was tough in the 70s and 80s. And that's why, Hagler lost a few fights. He lost to Bobby Watts, he lost to Willie Monroe. And obviously the draw with Vito Antuofermo, which was a disgrace, really, because he got robbed with that. He should have won that title hands down. I believe that was the same night as another fight, but I can't quite remember what it was. But either way, or it might have been the second, because he fights him again in 81, that's right. And I think it's the same night that there is another fight. I can't think who it is, but there is another one, either it's one of the Four Kings or not. But either way, Hagler was a tremendous fighter. He deserved more credit. I think he got it when he won that title against Alan Minter. Got some horrific abuse, shit thrown at him, police trying to protect him, and it was like, whoa, what the fuck is going on here? But his record, I mean, we talk about, I've threw it out there, I feel that Tommy Hearns is probably the greatest 1-4-5 fighter, super welter, junior middleweight, whatever you want to call it, than them all. I mean, there's no one out there, Terry Norris, Mike McCallum, Ronald Wright, whoever you want to throw us, he beats them all at that weight. But the biggest argument for me is with Marvin Hagler. I can't see beyond him other than maybe Monza, potentially as in the greatest middleweight of all time. So that's what I suppose we better go on to the next point, because I think the biggest fight and probably the best fight of the lot, Sean, is one of the shortest fights, not quite the shortest, but the second shortest fight, and that is the one with Tommy Hearns. And I think the one thing you see in this fight is Tommy's got power, Tommy Hearns, but he was not the same guy at middleweight as what Marvin Hagler was. And Marvin Hagler was a different animal. He really was. I mean, you look at that record of his from the point he won that title, and even before that, all the names he fought and how hard he fought to get those titles and how hard he fought to keep hold of them. I mean, the John McGarvey fight, we'll go into that in a little while, but I mean, the guy was an animal at middleweight and arguably the greatest middleweight of all time. And credit to Hearns stepping up and fighting him the way he fought him as well.
So before we start to talk about that fight, we've just got to round off a little bit more on Duran, because during this timeline, we were talking about how he was a bit topsy-turvy for Duran at this point. So obviously, going back to him losing the second fight to Ray Leonard, he then comes back and he goes on to fight Wilfred Benitez in 82. Of course, he has fights in between, but I'm just sort of skipping to the more relevant points for everybody. So he fights Benitez in 82, loses unanimous decision over 15 rounds to Benitez for the super welterweight title, the WBC. Then he goes on to fight Kirkland Lang, as you mentioned earlier, loses over 10 rounds, split decision, 1982 upset of the year in the Ring magazine. So 2 back-to-back losses there. He comes back, he has a good win over Pepino Cuevas, and then it's when he beats Davey Moore in 83 for the WBA super welterweight title, where people are starting to think, well, actually, there's still some life in this little fat man yet, because he certainly then puts himself in to probably the 2 toughest back-to-back fights you could possibly have. I mean, who has back-to-back fights against absolute legends like Hagler and Hearns? Like, I mean, obviously they weren't revered as legends at the time, of course, but when you look at that in hindsight now, it's like back-to-back he fights Davey Moore and beats him, then he fights Hagler and loses over 15 rounds in a close fight, as you rightly pointed out, and then he gets absolutely sparkled in 2 rounds by Tommy Hearns. And then it's at this point where we'll kind of leave Duran now to go back to the Hearns and Hagler moment, because the Hearns and Hagler moment by far is the most significant moment for me anyway, of the whole Four Kings debate. It really is the most significant moment, and I don't care what anybody says about Sugar Ray Leonard making that triumphant return, which we'll talk about. For me, this is the moment. This is the one that everybody will go on YouTube and watch. This is the one that always comes on Sky Sports, Boxing Gold at 11 o'clock at night or 12 o'clock at night after the main shows have gone on a Saturday night. It's always something like Hagler Hearns, isn't it? It's always this fight. This is the cultural impact that this fight had on boxing. Hagler and Hearns. Johnston, discuss.
What a fight. And as you say, it's the greatest fight of them all, out of all the fights between these guys. You got to think Hagler just come out of a really tough fight as well, against, no, he doesn't have a fight after against McGarvey. That's me jumping on. I'm jumping on guys. That was after this fight. But yeah, this is the best fight of the lot. Hearns stepping up in weight to fight Hagler, who was a dominant force. They have that great. We mentioned it in our Legendary Nights, where they have the planes situation where one's flying on better plane than the other, and they're moaning about it. And at the end of it, Hagler just cannot deal with Tommy Hearns. He can't stand him. And then you see that great press conference where you got Hagler with hankies in his ears because he's sick of hearing Tommy Hearns and what he's going to do to him. He's going to knock him out in 3 rounds. That's what Tommy Hearns predicted that he was going to do to Hagler. Hagler was, it did actually get postponed as well because of the finger injury. And you do hear Hagler sort of mention the fact that, he moaned about his little pinky finger and, how many guys would cut it off for $1 million. Hagler wanted it. He was ready for it. It was called the war. It ends up becoming the super fight because quite simply it was, Sean. It was a stunning fight. We've been through it so many times. I mean, anyone that isn't a boxing fan, or you want to bring someone into boxing, someone's like, I don't really know much about boxing, and what fight can I watch? Obviously, Corrales and Castillo, great fight to use. Hagler Hearns is the fight. Send that to anyone's direction and it will just grip you. The whole thing, the era, mid-80s, the music, the way they looked, the fans, the everything. It's in Caesar's Palace, it's in Nevada, it's in Vegas. It's just, oh, mate, it's got absolutely everything, Sean. It's got the star sitting at ringside, and they did not fail to deliver, did they?
No, they bloody didn't. It was the greatest fight, in my opinion, of that particular decade, and arguably of all time as well. I think it was absolutely fantastic. I really, really, really loved watching that fight back. I love watching it back now. Like you said, you send it to anybody and you're able to just win them over, aren't you, as a boxing fan? Like, anybody that doesn't like the sport, you send that to them and it's just absolutely fantastic. So that is the fight of the whole series for me. But then you've got to look at Leonard when he comes back into it. We mentioned him earlier. He goes into retirement on a second occasion and then doesn't come back until 1987 against Marvin Hagler. Now, a lot of these fights that we've covered here, we've done legendary nights on. We've done, obviously, the war. We've done Hagler and Hearns. We did a really good episode on that. We've done the super fight, as in Leonard and Hagler. We've done legendary nights on that. We've done the brawl in Montreal. We've done pretty much most of them, like we said at the top of the episode. So if you really do want a full breakdown and detailed storytelling episode, go and listen to them on our Legendary Nights podcast. So we're going to move on to the Hagler and Leonard situation. Now, the one story that came out of our podcast that we did on these two was something that I didn't know about until we did our research and we put the story together and we told it, which was how much preparation Sugar Ray Leonard did for that fight in the background, and nobody really knew about it. You know, this guy was having fights behind closed doors in preparation to get himself really sharp. And I mean, not just sparring sessions, actual fights behind closed doors to get himself ready for that Hagler fight. Everybody at that point surely would have had Hagler winning that fight. Surely would have had him winning that fight because Sugar Ray was the one coming off the back of a 3-year layoff. You know, he'd not been in the ring, or so we thought he'd not been in the ring, or so the fans at that time thought he'd not been in the ring. He'd been there behind closed doors, getting himself in preparation for it, and he always thought he had Hagler's number. So he comes back and he fights up at the middleweight division and challenges Marvin Hagler for the WBC middleweight title on the 6th of April, 1987. The super fight, and a debatable one. And it was a 12-rounder as well. It wasn't a 15-rounder. So there's a few elements to this conversation. There were conversations about this fight where people believe Marvin Hagler won. There's conversations about it where they think Sugar Ray Leonard won the fight. There's debates. We did our debates on our episode. But ultimately, I think when I just look at it from a fan's perspective without breaking anything down, you just had one hell of a fight between two guys, and it just proved how special Sugar Ray Leonard was, and it just adds more weight to the conversation from earlier where we were saying, like, did we lose the best years of Sugar Ray? I still think we did, but it also showed us how much talent he had as a fighter to be able to come back against the feared Marvin Hagler and was able to get that split decision over him.
Yeah, and I think it was the John Mugabe fight that was after the Hearns fight where Leonard see that fight and he said he could see chinks in his armour and Mugabe gave him hell that night, although Hagler did eventually knock him out in the 11th. Mugabe was a really hard fight for Hagler and Leonard sort of pinpointed that as the moment where, you know, there was certain elements of that he could exploit and you're right, Sean. I mean, the fact he's fighting proper fights. I mean, you had the gloves, you had rounds, like full round fights. He had referees, he had judges, no headgear, you know, to shake off that ring rust. He was a 4-1 bet in favour at Hagler, and it had fallen just before the fight. He was actually stripped of that WBA title as well for not fighting Harold Bomber Graham. So you were starting to end of this decade, 89, you're starting to see the politics of boxing coming in, and if your face fits, you keep the title. If it don't, it doesn't. You know what I mean? If you keep it, if it does. And, yeah, I mean, it's a debatable fight, Sean. It is. I mean, we had a debate about it. I still think Hagler wins the fight. I think that Hugh McAvenny made a great point when he mentioned that Sugar Ray Leonard was very clever and he used those last few seconds of each round to manipulate the judges' scorecards. And I've watched it since we've had our conversations before. I've watched it. I think I've probably watched the fight about 10 times. And I still feel that Hagler wins the fight. I just feel that he does enough on a constant basis for those rounds, for the 12 rounds it goes on for. And again, Sugar Ray Leonard uses his sense. He decides that he forces that 12. Oh, no, actually, is it even him? I think Hagler just accepts a 12-rounder. Then they put it to him and Hagler just accepts it, which is crazy because I think if there'd have been another 3 rounds, that might have gone in Hagler's favour, especially when you look at the Hagler-Duran fight. So, yeah, I mean, for me, I still believe, I don't think I'm ever going to change my mind, Sean, is I think that Hagler won the fight. I think he won it by about 2 rounds. But I could see the justification why people would go for Leonard. Don't get me wrong. I just think it was bursts rather than pressure, which what Hagler did on a constant basis pretty much for that whole fight.
It's debatable. I'm not going to debate it. I'm not going to debate it for too much longer on here because we've already done that. And if you want to listen to more of a debate, go and listen to that episode. What I am going to do is round up now some of the fights between them all. I think were a bit less significant at later stages of their careers. So in terms of Sugar Ray Leonard, he fights Tommy Hearns and Duran both in '89. He fights Hearns and has the WBC and WBO title and goes on and has a split decision draw with Hearns. Then he goes and beats Duran in their 3rd meeting, which, again, you know, the irony of that. And then obviously we know the rest of his career. He fights Terry Norris and loses in '81. Then he comes back 6 years later and fights Hector Macho Camacho and loses in 5. Complete shell of his former self at that point. So that's what happens with Sugar Ray's career. You want to look at Tommy Hearns' career, obviously after the big fight with Marvin Hagler, and he obviously continues his career. He goes on. You know, he has some really good fights. You could easily point out a few of them fights on the list that he has, but he does fight Ray Leonard, of course, and goes to the draws we just mentioned, and that's really the last fight he has with those guys in that Fab Four. And then we talk about Marvin Hagler. Well, you know what happened to Marvin Hagler? Marvin Hagler, after the Ray Leonard fight, retires. Never takes the rematch. Again, the conversation we had in that episode, like, it's it. He just retires and goes to Italy and lived his best life up until he passed away a couple of years ago. Fair play to him. He did what he wanted to do. He held his ground, and he could quite easily have had that rematch. In this day and age, when rematch clauses are in literally every single contract that is out there now, Marvin Hagler decided, for whatever reason, not to have the rematch with Sugar Ray Leonard, even though it was a very, very, very close fight, whichever way you look at it. And then, let's not forget about... We've called him the little fat man throughout this episode. You started it, so I'm gonna finish it off by calling it in one more time. We've got the little fat man in Roberto Duran, who obviously then, once he has his fight with Tommy Hearns in '84, he has one more fight, which is with Ray Leonard in 1989. Of course, he has fights in between and afterwards, but in terms of this whole Fab Four scenario, the Four Kings scenario, he fights Ray Leonard for a 3rd time and loses via unanimous decision in 1989. So I suppose this part of the show now is our opportunity just to have a quick conversation about the burning questions that people always have when we talk about the Fab Four, and that is, who is the greatest fighter of the Fab Four? Which is the best fight of that series out of the Fab Four? So, Johnston, coming over to you, the best fighter. Or, let's put it in a different way. Let's say the best, because it is very subjective. Who is your favourite fighter out of them Fab Four?
My favourite fighter out of the Fab Four is probably Roberto Duran. I just think... the funny thing is it's more when he was a lightweight. I mean, that's just the crazy thing about it. Although the brawl in Montreal was great, and he lost to them all. So I mean, he is my favourite fight. He's one of my favourite fighters of all time, Duran. And I do love Tommy Hearns as well. I like all 4 of them. I mean, they're all likeable guys. I love Hagler's attitude. I love his attitude. You know, he ain't gonna fight me. Fine, I'll fight someone else. And he ain't gonna fight me. Fuck it, I'm gonna retire. I love that about him. Hearns would fight anyone. I think he's the only one that's a 5-weight world champion out of them all as well. Even more so than Duran. I think Duran might even be 4. I can't remember now off the top of my head. It goes between both. I think Duran's my favourite. In terms of competitiveness against them all, he was just too small for him. I think that's the brunt of it here. So yeah, for me, Duran, I'm going to just throw out there. Duran is my favourite of the four. More probably inclined because of his 70s career in the lightweight division, and for him to go on and beat Duran early and fight them all and give them all a tough fight apart from Hearns. So yeah, Duran.
Well, my favourite fighter out of the Fab Four is probably going to be Hagler. I just loved like the whole attitude of Hagler. I loved that he overcame adversity. I love that it took him longer than the rest of them to get that success, and I think that's what I love about him. He was an underdog story. He goes in, he has the biggest fight in boxing history with Tommy Hearns. He beats him, and he has great fights throughout his career. He retires after losing to Sugar Ray Leonard and lives his best life. And he's a guy, he just got out of the game when he wanted to. He just did it on his terms, and I like that. He's my favourite fighter out of the Fab Four. And I think it's a no-brainer with regards to the best fight out of the series. It's obviously Hagler and Hearns. Surely you can't be going against me on that one.
No, Hagler and Hearns is the best fight of the bunch, and then I'd say probably Hearns and Leonard, their first fight as well. And then Leonard again with Duran. But the one thing I will say though, I'm rounding this off on what I want to just throw out here. The best lightweight of all out of these guys, Duran. I mean, you're gonna look here. Duran is probably the best lightweight of all time. When you look at the welterweight division, the only one better than Sugar Ray Leonard is probably Sugar Ray Robinson. That's saying something. When you look at the super welterweight, junior middleweight, the only one, I don't think there's anyone better than Tommy Hearns at that weight. Tommy Hearns was a beast. He would have knocked anyone in any time, at any point of anywhere in history. Honest to God. But the only one that could come close to him would probably be fucking useless, isn't I? What's the fella's name? Who's the Murderer's Row guy? Sure.
Charlie Burley.
Charlie Burley. I feel so bad. Charlie Burley's probably the only one that could probably compete with Tommy Hearns at that weight, or because he didn't really fight that weight, but he would have been devastating. And in middleweight, I mean, Hagler's can go Greb, you go Monzon, Hagler. Best three middleweights full time.
Well, that's a good way to round it up, to be honest with you. He's talking about how their significance is in boxing history in terms of where you would sit them at in terms of the best fighters in their own weight categories, in their natural weight categories. It's a good way, but the whole who's the best out of the four of them is very subjective, and I'm not even going to get into that debate for this one because it's too hard to even discuss. But what I will say is thank you to everybody for listening to the show. As always, this has just been a Shooting the Breeze episode on the Four Kings or the Fab Four or whatever you want to label them, and we've really enjoyed sitting down and reminiscing on some of the stories, the fights, the timelines, the significance of the whole Fab Four era and what it meant for the sport of boxing, and we hope you've enjoyed this sit-down reminiscent episode too. Now, if you've listened to this and you've not heard any of our other stuff, please go and check out the career profile of every single one of them fighters and the legendary nights. We've got the Brawl in Montreal, including the Nomas fight. We've got Hagler and Leonard. We've got Hagler and Hearns. So please go and check out Legendary Nights as well and check out some of the stories behind some of these magnificent nights in this sport. If you've enjoyed listening to the show, please let us know on social media at BTR Boxing Pod on Twitter, on Facebook and on Instagram, and you can find us on TikTok too. Big shout out to the patrons of the podcast. Thank you so much, as always, for your continued support. You'll have had early access and ad-free access to this episode, so thank you for your support. And if you're not a patron and you want to check out what we do, please go to patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast, and you can actually go and get exclusive patron-only content like our series, Boxing Through the Decades, and some of our one-off patron-only episodes, as well as getting early access to all the series-based content that is out there, and generally just supporting us and helping us achieve our dream of doing this more often than not. But that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Shooting the Breeze, the Fab Four of Boxing.